Hello, everyone, and welcome to Boltic Scouting Podcast's second Q&A episode. On our Instagram story at Boltic Scouting, we asked you for questions for this episode, and here we're going to answer all of your questions. And this is our first podcast episode that's going to be recorded visually, and it'll be up on YouTube shortly.
All right, so we can start off the first question that brought up Carson Strong, and the question was, do we think he will be a first-round pick? So I think we can really split that question up into two different parts. We can split up to like what we think about Carson Strong as a prospect, and then what we think NFL scouts and GMs will think, and ultimately if the NFL will think of him as a first-round pick. So, Carson, you want to start off with what you think about Carson Strong?
Yeah, I think the first thing that pops right off the tape is his physical traits. He's got the prototypical size. He's tall. He's well built, and he's got a cannon of an arm. He flashes a beautiful deep ball where he can really drop it in the bucket from 50 yards out with effortless zip, and that really gets you impressed right from the bat. He's a generally accurate quarterback, more so in the short game and the deep game than the intermediate, because I do see him sometimes overthrowing some sideline throws, but overall he's a pretty accurate quarterback. Where some of his flaws are is he has inconsistent ball placement, where sometimes the wide receiver is going to have to adjust either low or high to get the ball, and that's not ideal. But the crucial thing is he doesn't typically put the ball in danger of being picked off by the opponent. And a couple other flaws that I saw in his game were that he sometimes locks onto his first read. He takes too many sacks and needs to throw the ball away more consistently, and his mobility is not great. It's not bad, but he's not the super athletic quarterback who can extend plays to the point that we're seeing in this new modern NFL.
Yeah, I think we pretty much agreed on what we saw from him. Obviously, I really loved his arm strength. He threw the ball effortlessly down the field, like you said. And to me, the biggest thing was that most of his negatives were things that I believe can be pretty much coached out of him. I think people can work on his footwork. They'll help his accuracy, his ball placement, I think. One of the things I noticed was he really held onto the ball too long, and he would just take sacks that were just completely unnecessary. But I thought as the season progressed on that he showed improvement in that and not holding the ball as long as he did at the beginning of the season. The only knock that I say couldn't be really coached out is his mobility. I think there's a ceiling to his mobility that most of the quarterbacks would exceed. So I think that to me his mobility is his biggest red flag, simply because it can't really be coached out. But I think he's a really intriguing prospect moving forward into this draft season. So if you want to talk about what you think the NFL will think about him, and then I'll add what I think.
Yeah, first, I think that for me, he's probably going to grade out as a round 2 prospect is what I'm thinking right now. Because crucially, he did see a lot of progression in some of his flaws throughout the season, as I said, and his only flaw that really isn't coachable is his mobility. And you're seeing in the NFL today, a lot of these quarterbacks come in with the great physical traits and are a little raw, like Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Justin Herbert, and they end up getting the coaching they need to be successful. So I'm really optimistic for his future development. But I do think the fact that he is that raw and his mobility, not issues, but he's not as good as the rest. I feel, but I do believe that there is a chance that we become equal Carson Strong going in the first round NFL draft, because at the combine, in shorts, he's going to wow everyone. Not many people know about him right now, but he's going to throw a beautiful deep ball. He looks the part with his size, and I think that he's the type of developmental quarterback that the NFL looks for, apart from the limited mobility. And so I wouldn't be surprised if he sneaks into the back of the end of the first round, because when you compare him to a Mac Jones or a Kyle Trask, who are also kind of in that territory, he have the raw physical tools. He has an advantage in that category compared to the other two. So I could see the NFL I could see a team in the back end of the first round falling in love with his physical traits and the improvement that he's shown over his 2 seasons and saying, look, we can turn him into the franchise quarterback.
Yeah, I totally agree with most of the stuff that you said. I also see him as a second round prospect. I think his arm strength and his raw physical traits are some traits that you could see in a first rounder, but I just think his mobility really keeps him in that second round, and the fact that he's still raw, he still needs development. For me, I can't put him as a first round prospect, but I think he'll be a really solid second round prospect. And like you said, I really think he's going to be more of a late riser in the draft. I think somebody kind of like Jordan Love around this time, late December, early January. Jordan Love was not talked about as a first round prospect. And then as we moved into the draft season, he had the combine performance that slowly started to make him rise. People said, "Wow, Jordan Love is a great arm." We could really develop him into a franchise quarterback, as the Packers obviously believe they can. And I think Strong would be very similar, have a similar rise to Jordan Love. And I could 100% see him after the combine becoming a topic of first round conversation. And then by the draft day, I really think he'll be a late first round draft pick.
Our next question is somebody asked us if we see Jimmy Garoppolo being the week 1 starting quarterback for the 49ers. In my opinion, I think the answer to that is yes. Partly because Kyle Shanahan did say, I think it was today, that he expects Garoppolo to be the starting quarterback, but also because they were a quarter away from winning the Super Bowl with him last year. The offense has been built around him. If you see how they've built that offense, he does have some limitations. He's an accurate passer, but he's not really dynamic, and he's not a deep threat throwing the ball. So they've got an offense that has elite run after the catch ability with Deebo Samuel, George Kittle, and their rookie first rounder Brandon Ayuk. And so they've built the offense around him. They were a quarter away from winning the Super Bowl with him. And this year he was injured. Kittle was injured. Samuel was injured. A lot of the defense was injured. So this season is really not something that I feel the 49ers are going to look at and think, you know what, Garoppolo shouldn't be our starting quarterback. So I do see him as a starter week 1.
I just want to touch on some of the last things you mentioned about, this season he was injured. To me, that's a huge red flag. He was injured most of the season. Obviously, he was healthy last year when they made the Super Bowl run, but he was injured the full year before. He's been for the 49ers for 3 years, and he's played 1 full season and 2 or 3 games. On top of that, you can't have a franchise quarterback who's playing every other season. That's just not – your franchise quarterback has to be reliable. So to me, I'm not 100% sure that he will be. I think there are a lot of intriguing quarterbacks in the draft. Obviously, I think if they draft a quarterback, Garoppolo will end up being the day 1 starter, just because they're not in position to draft someone that's ready to start day 1. I think Kyle Shanahan will want to develop them. But I also think there'll be a lot of very interesting quarterbacks in free agency this year. I think one that comes to mind is Matthew Stafford. I know there's been talk about the Lions wanting to just completely reset, clean house, obviously clean house with coach and GM. People have said, they just want to get rid of Matthew Stafford. Maybe Matthew Stafford wants to leave because the Lions have really done nothing for him in his career, which is unfortunate. I think he's a really underrated quarterback. But someone like Matthew Stafford, I could see, maybe the 49ers say, hey, we'll throw you a 5th-round pick. We'll take Matthew Stafford. And I think that's really maybe not something that a lot of people are talking about, but I really think somebody like Matthew Stafford, or even Matt Ryan, there's been talk about Atlanta wanting to move on from Matt Ryan for whatever reason. I don't really know. But I think, one of those 2 guys I could really see being the starter, because I think neither of them have really had injury concerns. Matthew Stafford plays through pretty much everything. He's an Iron Man. But I brought up Matt Ryan because Kyle Shanahan has that connection. They went to Super Bowl 51 together. Shanahan was the offensive coordinator. So one of those 2 I could really see being the day 1 starter. So I'm going to say it's probably about 60-40. I'll give 60% chance Garoppolo is the day 1 starter, 40% chance he isn't.
Yeah.
And that kind of leads us into our next question.
Well, excuse me.
Um,
I just want to say another thing about this one. I think that they would want to explore the option of bringing in a veteran, but my hesitance on saying that as a realistic option is that Jimmy Garoppolo does have a really big salary, and I don't see. I'm not an expert on the financials of being a general manager, but I do you see them being able to juggle Garoppolo's salary and bringing in a different quarterback that's a veteran?
so what I've heard and what I've read is that yes, he has a really big salary, but they're heading into the fourth year of his contract now. So most of his guaranteed money is pretty much gone. I think if I'm correct, I could be wrong, but what I heard is it's only like a $2 or $3 million cap hit if they do get rid of him. So I don't think that the salary will be an issue in moving on from him.
Yeah, I think I think that my gut feeling kind of leans towards they've built this offense around him. They're invested in him. They'll stick with him as their quarterback. I do want to throw out the last possibility of handling the situation like the Eagles did with Carson Wentz, and maybe in that second round range, they take a guy like the Eagles did with Jalen Hurts, where it's an insurance policy if your quarterback goes down for injury again, but also if he ends up not playing up to expectations like Wentz did, you can slide in somebody who you've taken it with a pick that's not too big of an investment, but definitely a fair investment. So that's the last possibility I would want to throw out. I do think that whether it's just sticking with him completely or drafting a guy in that range, he'll be the week one starter either way. But there are a lot of options on the table clearly for the 49ers.
Yeah, so I want to go into our next question now. Obviously, I brought up Matt Ryan, the possibility that Atlanta moves on from him. And another question we got was actually about, do we think the Falcons will draft a quarterback in the first round? I can start off with that one. See, my gut tells me no. I feel like obviously I brought up Matt Ryan as a possibility of moving on, but I don't think that he will. I think, they're bringing a new GM, a new head coach. I think Matt Ryan has the talent, obviously. I think the coach will say, look, we don't have the first overall pick, the second overall pick. We're not in line for obviously Trevor Lawrence, probably not. One of the other top quarterbacks. I think they'll be around 7 or 8. I have a feeling that the top 3 will go and within the top 6 picks. We'll get to that, weeks and months later down the line as we get closer to draft season. I just don't think they'll be in position to draft one of the top 3 quarterbacks. And I just think that the new head coach will say, you know what, we'll give it a year with Matt Ryan, see what happens. And I could see potentially them taking quarterback in 2022 if Matt Ryan shows struggles this year. But my gut feeling is they'll stick with Matt Ryan and they won't take a quarterback in the first round.
Yeah, I think they're in a really weird situation where they've got Matt Ryan and Julio Jones who are still performing as one as for Julio Jones one of the top 10 players in his at his position. Matt Ryan probably the top 15 at his position, where they can still probably try to make a run with those two, but at the same time, the rest of the roster is not up to par, and by the time they rebuild the rest of the roster, they might end up missing out on that closing window that is Matt Ryan and Julio Jones's careers. So, and the thing is, they're actually sitting at 4th overall in the draft order right now, with 1 week ahead of us. And they're playing the Buccaneers. The Buccaneers, if they choose to play hard and not rest their starters in order to secure what could be the fifth seed in the NFC, which this year is an advantage given that the NFC East is not as strong as some of the other teams they might face. I don't see them winning that game, which means that they could really end up with a top 4 overall pick. So I think that if so Trevor Lawrence will be going number 1 overall to the Jaguars. I would say at 2 or 3, either Zach Wilson, the quarterback from BYU, or Justin Fields, the quarterback from Ohio State, will be going. If one of those two is on the board at the Falcons' pick, and they've done their homework, they fell in love with him, I don't think they'll hesitate to pick that guy. But it's all about whether or not he'll be available and whether or not they do fall in love with him, because when you're making that investment, especially given that you do still have Matt Ryan at quarterback, that means you really have to be convinced that he is your franchise guy. So in the end, I think it will all rest on their evaluation of whatever the best quarterback available is.
Yeah, you're right. I think that I didn't actually realize that they were that far up in the draft order at 4. So I think you're right. I think it comes down to if they think whichever of the 3 quarterbacks would be left for them, assuming they pick at 4, if they think that quarterback will be better than Matt Ryan within the next 2 years. Because let's be honest, Matt Ryan has 2 more really good seasons. Then, 3 years down the line, they probably will be in position to draft another quarterback. So it really comes down to this 2 to 3 year window of if they think Matt Ryan can still play at a near elite level, maybe even regain his MVP form. So it really comes down to what they think of Matt Ryan, what they think of one of these top 3 quarterbacks, assuming one falls to them. So I think it's really up in the air. It's still early in draft season. I don't think we know what they think about any of these guys yet. It might be a question that might be intriguing to talk about again, maybe when it gets closer in April.
Yeah, they haven't even hired their next GM or head coach, so they know just as much as we do about what they're going to do. But it's definitely a storyline to follow, given that they are looking like they're going to have a high pick in the draft.
Definitely, and we can move on to our next question now, and it asks if we think that 2 Michigan Wolverines will go in the first round. So you can touch on that first.
Yeah, I think that Pay, the defensive end from Michigan, he's gotten injured recently, but he really had a good stretch of games during his season in 2020, and I think he's a lock to go in the first round. He's really well built with a compact build, and he's finally shown some refinement to go with that, because he's also really a freak athlete given his size. And so now that we've seen both the size, the athleticism, and now some refinement to his pass rush ability come in, I think we're looking at him like a lock in the first round. If you look at the other guys they have, 2 names are Nico Collins and Aiden Hutchinson, who are a wide receiver and a defensive end, respectively. Nico Collins opted out. Aiden Hutchinson, if he declares, I think they're both going to be more in that day 2 range. I don't see either of them slipping to the first round. So for me, this question is really, will Jalen Mayfield, the offensive tackle, go in the first round? I think that this is, I would tend to say no, but again, I think a lot depends on his combine performance, because he's a powerful offensive lineman. He's got a lot of experience for a 20-year-old prospect, but he's not the quickest. But the combine if he tests well athletically and he looks good in that regard at the combine, then teams could think, look, we see him as the total package. And when I'm looking at the last few drafts, we've seen guys who are consensus second rounders on the offensive line. I'm thinking Caleb McGarry, Joshua Garnett, Cedric Ogbuehi. We've seen them slip into that first round in the first round. Team at the end of the first round likes Jalen Mayfield and he's convinced that the combine, I could see him slipping into the first round. So I would give this like a 60% of chance. There's only Pay as a Michigan Wolverine going the first round, 40% chance that Mayfield joins him.
Yeah, I'm going to disagree slightly with you on this. I do think that Mayfield slips into the first round just because of the importance that has been placed on getting a really solid offensive tackle. From early tape study, I feel like he's been better than some of the offensive tackles that we've seen go in the first round, and that's really the biggest reason why I think he will end up in the first round. I don't think I'll end up with a first round grade on him, but I just think, if we look at last year, we had, the top 4 offensive tackles go in the top 15 picks or so. And then at the end of the draft, we had another small run on offensive tackles, because after that second group of guys, there was a big drop off last year. And I think people will be concerned about that again this year. I think this is a solid offensive tackle draft. So I think I could see, 3 guys go in the top 20. And then I think we could see another 2 maybe go in the back end of that, just because of the importance of the offensive tackle position. And I think that he will end up being, not one of the top 3, but I think he could be, in the 4, 5, 6 range for some teams, and teams that are at the end of the first round say, we need an offensive tackle. he won't be there when we pick again. So I think we have to pick him now, and I think that's why he's going to end up in the first round.
Yeah, I think the crucial point though is that for me this is actually a loaded offensive line class and also at offensive tackle. I think in my opinion, even though last year's class got a lot of hype, I think this class is better. And the let's kind of hash out the names. I think that we know Penei Sewell is a generational talent. He's going to be going in the top 3 most likely. I think Rashawn Slater from Northwestern and Christian Darrisaw from Virginia Tech will be top 15, top 20 picks. Slater's just a really good all around player, solid strength, solid athleticism, good technician. Darrisaw, his technique is not quite there yet, but he's got an amazing combination of athleticism and size and power. So I think that those 3 are going to be in top 15, top 20, and then there's really a logjam for that next tier. And I think you're right. We're going to see 2 or 3 slip into the first round after them. And then it's just a question of will Mayfield be able to make himself one of those 2 or 3? Because you've got guys like Evan Jenkins from Oklahoma State. You have Elijah Vera Tucker. If teams view him as a tackle, and I think a team will and take him in the first round from USC. There's Alex Leatherwood from Alabama. And so there's just and Sam Cosmi from Texas. There's a lot of stiff competition to be in that next tier. I do think 2 or 3 will go, but in the end, I think it's really how he's going to test at the combine, his pro day, how he's going to interview, and so it's really going to be up to each of the individual boards of those teams at the end of the first round that do want to grab an offensive tackle. And so that's why I said 60-40, because given the talent that there is in this class, I do lean towards a couple of the other guys hearing their names on day one and him hearing it in the first half of the second round, but he definitely could slip into day one.
Yeah, I just want to point out as a last point of this question, we saw 5 go in the first round last year. Like I said, no, sorry, 6. We saw 6 go. You saw Isaiah Wilson late to the Tennessee Titans. So I think we saw 6 last year. I would not be surprised at all if we saw 6 this year. And like you said, I agree. I think this year's offensive tackle prospects are better than last year's. So I would not be surprised at all if we saw 6 or even 7, just because of, like you said, the talent and just the importance put on the offensive tackle position. So we can move on to our final question of the day. And this question asks about Lavert Hill. And it just simply says, why is there no love for Lavert Hill? So I know you wanted to touch on that first.
Well, it sounds like a peculiar question, but let's bring it on. Lavert Hill was an undrafted free agent, I think, last year out of Michigan, a cornerback. And I think that when I was watching him, I gave him a 6.5, which, if you're not familiar with our grading scale at Boltake Scouting, is a mid-6th round grade. And so I thought that he would have a chance to stick on a roster, and I maintain that. He's currently on the Eagles practice squad, and if you look at his athletic profile, he lacks the size and speed that you want at the corner position, which is probably what's kept him off a actual 53-man roster up until now. But I was really impressed by his competitive toughness when I scouted him a year ago, and so I think that once he gets an actual offseason, now that he's going to be entering his 3rd year in the league, I think that he'll be able to show that he's an. Excuse me. I think he was drafted in 2020, not 2019. That was my bad. But now, so this was a really shortened offseason, so he didn't really get to wow the coaches with that competitive toughness. They just looked at his height, weight, and speed numbers and were not impressed and left him off the roster. But with another offseason of being able to actually showcase that trait that really puts him above some of the other guys that have his physical profile, I think that he could stick at the back end of a roster as a depth nickel cornerback.
Yeah, I think we see as the NFL is growing, and we see the pass game becoming so much more prominent. And you see a lot of teams, they have 3 cornerbacks on the field at all times. I think there's rosters are going to end up having maybe 6 cornerbacks on the roster. So I would not be surprised to see him next year on an active roster. I think he could really be a solid depth piece, like you said. The size and the speed, not really what people want to see from a corner, but I agree. He showed a lot of heart, a lot of competitiveness on film. So I think that will be able to keep him on a roster. but I don't really see too much attention for him. Maybe having him come in as a fourth corner. Somebody gets injured playing in the slot, and that's really what I see for him in his future.
Yep, I think that's right on, and so that wraps up this Q&A session, and we'll be having plenty of podcast episodes to come in the near future. We're going to be discussing mock drafts. We're going to be discussing different positions in the draft, and just a lot of content as this draft season really turns the corner into 2021, and we get full steam ahead towards April. It's going to be fun. So remember to join us next time. We'll be having another Q&A soon, and just have a nice turn of the year, and we're wishing you the best, and we hope to have you soon.
Yeah, I just want to point out, like you said, Q&As. Be sure if you have any questions, when we put up our Q&A thing on our Instagram stories, be sure to ask questions then. But if you have a question come to you when we don't have a Q&A posted up, feel free to send us a DM and say, hey, I have this question. Would you mind, answering it? Or so we might answer it then. We might say, oh, we really like this question. Can we save it for our next Q&A? So, you don't have to wait for when we put up Q&As to ask questions. We love to have interaction with you guys and get feedback. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.